So we're going to start the recording. Again, my name is Benji Cohen with Minnesota DNR. Welcome to our 185th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. We got a lot of people interested in bobcats in Minnesota today, and we're joined by two great guys, John Erb from the DNR and Michael Joyce, who works with the Natural Resources Research Institute over at the university. Just to kind of share what they're learning about bobcats and how the population is in Minnesota. So, John, I think you're going to go first. We'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Benji, and welcome to everybody who's joined online. As he said, my name is John Erb. I'm a wildlife research biologist with the DNR up in Grand Rapids. Most of my job focuses on research and monitoring associated with the big group of species we call fur bearers, so everything from weasels to wolves. Today we're going to be just talking about bobcats. I always assume there's kind of a mixed audience in terms of existing knowledge about bobcats, so I try and have a lot of basic stuff as well as maybe a little bit of data detail as well. So hopefully I strike the right balance and have something of interest to everybody. So we'll jump. Oh, I should mention that Michael Joyce is going to speak at the end. He'll give his own little introduction, but I'm going to be talking more about bobcat numbers, ecology, and then he's going to kind of feed into how sometimes when we're doing one research project on a species, it leads to new questions, which is what happened in our case. We were doing a study of fishers, and that led to a lot of bobcat questions. And so he'll talk about that and then how we go about doing research in a new project he's doing on bobcats. With that, I always like to start with some background. We do have 3 different wild cat species in Minnesota. Bobcats are by far the most numerous. We estimate about 6,000 bobcats in the fall population right now. We also have lynx in Minnesota, primarily in the northeast, but scattered across most of the borders, counties that border Canada. Don't have as good an estimate there, but likely in the number of 100 to 300 lynx in Minnesota. We do get occasional mountain lions, more now than we did when I first started 25 years ago. But it seems to be the case that they're still just wandering dispersers that come to Minnesota and other Midwestern states from out west. We don't have any good idea of how many are in the state at any one time. They wander, they come, they go. I would guess most of the time there's less than 10 of them running around Minnesota, but that's just kind of a guess. But we do have 3 cats in the state. Bobcats and lynx are the most similar in terms of size and appearance, so I'm going to talk a little bit about distinguishing those two. One of the distinguishing traits, which you don't always see unless you get really good photos or close-up views, but their tail tips, they both have short tails, anywhere from 2-3 inches up to 6 or 8 inches long. The tip of the tail on a lynx looks like it's been dipped in black ink, so it's got black all the way around the tail tip on top and bottom, as you see in the left photo. With bobcats, they have a black tip, but only on the top, as you can see in the right photo, and most of the underside of the tail is white colored. So really looking close at a tail tip, if you get photos, is usually an important diagnostic to distinguish lynx from bobcats. Another one is looking at the coloration on the bottom of the feet. You can see the lynx on the left. The bottoms of their feet tend to be fairly tan, light colored, buff colored, whereas bobcat, the bottom of their feet on the right tend to be fairly black colored. And you can often see this even in nighttime trail camera photos, for example. You can see some differences. So looking at the coloration on the bottom of the feet is another trait to pay attention to if you get a photo. Ear patches, both bobcats and lynx do have some lighter colored ear patches on the back side of their ears. Lynx, generally, it's a little less noticeable, often more gray, buff colored, sometimes not really even a patch at all to speak of. But they often have some indications of a patch on the back of their ears, whereas bobcats, it's almost always more noticeable, more white colored. So not quite as much of a diagnostic, but it's something to look at as well. Certainly it's useful if you get a nighttime photo and don't see whether there's a tail or not. Mountain lions do not have any sort of light colored patch on the back of their ear. Rather, they have black. The entire center of their back of their ear is black, kind of a black patch with a little lighter fringe around the edge of the ear. As you've seen in the previous photos in here, the overall body coloration tends to be a little different, with lynx being a little more gray, black colored, and bobcats tend to have more of a brownish tint to most of them. I will show some photos in a minute to illustrate that bobcats can be quite variable in color. But as a rough guide, what you see here, that bobcats tend to be more brownish colored, and lynx a little more gray, white, and so on. The other thing in this photo you can see is the ear tufts. On the left, lynx have really long ear tufts, up to 2.5 inches long, whereas bobcats will either have, this photo on the right shows almost essentially no ear tufts, but most will have at least a small tuft on the tops of their ears, but rarely will it go much more than a 1/2 inch long, maybe 3/4, but almost always less than an inch, whereas lynx will be closer to 2.5 inches. The roughs on the cheeks as well. This isn't probably the greatest illustration, but the roughs on the cheeks of a lynx tend to be more noticeable, larger, fluffier than those on a bobcat as well. Bobcats throughout the United States are pretty common. This is a bit of a dated distribution map, with the white areas at that time indicating where bobcats were generally not. Much of this white area you see in the Midwest is now at least partially filled in. We certainly have bobcats now scattered at least around much of southern Minnesota. Most of eastern Iowa has bobcats, northwest or northeast Missouri. More areas in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and certainly most of Michigan has bobcats. So there isn't much white left on the map. Bobcats are found almost everywhere in the United States, with the exception of maybe some of the most intense agricultural areas or highly urbanized areas. And they're found again from near desert conditions to mountainous areas to grasslands to forests. So certainly a habitat generalist in many respects. This just shows the bobcat again in this maroon color, but shows the lynx distribution in green. Much more of a northern species, but there are these kind of 3 broad areas in the lower 48 where these species can overlap a little bit, but lynx kind of bounce down into the lower 48 in the northeast U.S., up in Maine especially, but a few detections in Vermont and New Hampshire. Minnesota in the north central area, really not any detections in Wisconsin or Michigan now, like this graph tends to hint in these pink colors, mostly Minnesota here in the Midwest. And out west, then they come down into the U.S. Lynx do in Idaho, Montana, and Colorado's reintroduced some lynx, northern Washington as well. So kind of these 3 areas where lynx come down into the lower 48. Mountain lions, just real quick. Historically, they were found throughout the entire U.S. for quite some time now, mostly restricted to the western U.S. And with populations in the Black Hills and northeast Nebraska being the closest to the Midwest of Minnesota. A lot of the states in Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri are getting more of these wanderers, dispersers coming in, but they're all genetic evidence indicates typically coming from these western areas and just dispersing into the Midwest looking for new territories. A little history on bobcats in Minnesota. Again, they were found throughout almost all the state prior to European settlement, except maybe some of northeast Minnesota and along the Canadian border. Particular areas that were deeper snow and more boreal forest conditions, those were areas where lynx were primarily found. At the turn of the century and decades after that, the agricultural conversion of the landscape, unregulated harvest of bobcats, a variety of other factors really reduced bobcat numbers and range by 1965. In the southern part of the state especially, they were essentially became non-existent in much of southern Minnesota. They may have actually increased in some areas of the north just because of some of the same habitat disturbances actually benefited bobcats a little bit in the north, created a little more younger forest, broken forest. More recent times, winters may be a little milder, which may help out bobcats a little bit. Bobcats were completely unprotected in Minnesota and most of the country, for many decades. We even had bounties on bobcats as there was for wolves and coyotes and other stuff. From 1951 to 1965, there was anywhere from 500 to 1,700 bobcats taken as part of the bounty program, and that was on top of harvest as high as 1,800 bobcats a year, normal harvest, not bounty. So a lot of effort at the turn of the century and several decades later at trying to reduce or eliminate many carnivores throughout most of the United States. Excuse me. Starting in 1977, bobcats, a harvest season was established. Prior to that, besides the bounties, they could just be taken year round for any reason. But in 1977, harvest seasons were established more like traditional seasons during the fall and winter. Bobcat numbers were fairly low at that time. Probably were taking about 250 a year for a 25-year period there. But bobcats really began to increase again around 2000. And over the most recent 23-year period, harvests have been more in the range of 500 to 1,800. So anywhere from 2 to 7 times more now than what were taken from a 25-year period in the late 70s through the early 2000s. This is a map that just kind of shows where bobcats are predominantly in Minnesota. For most of my years here, this left graph, kind of an oval area that runs from Pine County, Minnesota, up through Itasca, up towards Beltrami, and then kind of this north central lakes country has been the stronghold of bobcats. Really none in the southern part of the state for many years. They did expand into northwest Minnesota and have pushed their way into some of these areas further north and northeast that have traditionally been lynx country, but they're still fairly absent from some of that true deep snow country we think of in the Arrowhead. But as bobcats expanded even in northern Minnesota, we began getting more detections in southern Minnesota. You see on the graph on the right. We're pretty certain based on some initial DNA evidence, but just other information that cats in southern Minnesota are probably getting there from both northern Minnesota as the population expanded there. Some started moving south, but bobcats were also increasing quite a bit in northern Missouri first, and then all throughout much of Iowa, with the exception of north central Iowa, the most intense agricultural areas. But Iowa now has bobcats in the whole southern part of the state, and for sure the eastern and western halves all the way up to the Minnesota border. So those cats, as they expanded, were coming into Minnesota as well. So southern Minnesota kind of became this mixing ground of southern cats coming north and northern cats coming south. And they seem to be doing quite well, especially in southeast Minnesota, but getting plenty of detections along Minnesota river valleys and a few other places in southern Minnesota. This graph's got a little bit, it's kind of a little bit busy, but kind of trying to illustrate several things here. I already mentioned that bobcat numbers were lower comparatively and stable from the late 70s up through about 2000. We began trying to estimate bobcat numbers through population modeling around 1977, and it projects fairly stable population. But beginning again around the year 2000, we saw pretty dramatic increases. We do some separate track surveys for a lot of carnivores, and those track indices were showing dramatic increases as well, and harvests of bobcats began increasing. So this period, sort of around 2000, is when we saw a big shift in bobcat numbers in the north, and that probably contributed to some of that expansion into southern Minnesota as well. If you look at this graph on the left, which goes further back in time to the late 1920s, you can see it suggests from harvest data alone that we had even more bobcats in the 1940s and 50s than we do today, even though we've seen this increase. And that was likely a result of the turn of the century, logging and other things in the northern part of the state, which actually improved habitat, created a lot of young forest, a lot of edges, openings, a little more prey diversity. And that led to a bobcat explosion in the 1940s, 50s. But as the forest aged again, we think that's what explains the lower but stable numbers through the 60s, 70s, and at least much of the 80s. And then as logging really picked up again in the mid 80s to mid to late 80s and continued for a couple decades at least, bobcats began a resurgence. And you can see this one graph shows from 85 to 2005, there was an estimated 70% increase in young forest in the northern part of the state. So I think that's a big contributor to this most recent increase we see here. And we'll see what the future holds. Bobcats, this is a little bit older data from a study we did in the late 70s, early 80s. But territory sizes probably average 20 to 25 square miles for males. So, an area 5 miles by 4 miles or 5 by 5, a male will use. Females are a little bit smaller than that, 10 to 20 square miles. There is some overlap in home ranges between males and females, and males will overlap some. Females are the ones that appear to be a little bit more territorial. As I mentioned before, we estimate right now about 6,000 bobcats, and this would be in the northern part of the state. That translates into about one bobcat for every 8 square miles. And that would include, bobcat kittens in the fall. So there's overlap, kittens overlapping with their mother still in the fall, males overlapping, but it would work out to about one bobcat for 8 square miles in the northern part of the state. As I mentioned beginning, bobcat coloration tends to be a little more orangey brown than lynx, but this shows there's a lot of variability. This picture in the top right is one from southern Minnesota, a cat that looks more leopardy-like. My limited data says that some of these cats coming from Iowa and from the south tend to have a little more spotting than some of the cats we've traditionally had in much of northern Minnesota, but don't have enough data to say whether that's a real strong pattern or not. But you see some this is affected by bright lighting, but a lot of our cats tend to be fairly brown and orange with not a lot of markings. Some get a little more gray like the center picture with more spotting. And we've never detected a black one in Minnesota. In fact, this is very rare throughout the entire, United States, but there are occasional melanistic bobcats that turn up. I think this one was maybe from somewhere in the Northeast US. So there are very, very rare ones that are actually melanistic. They're 3 to 3.5 foot long, including their short tail. Males maybe weigh an average of 25 pounds, females 17 pounds. And you can see in this bottom central picture an old study or radio collaring coyotes and bobcats, but bobcats in general are going to be smaller in length and size than coyotes. Weight-wise, they can compete with, a lot of coyotes, but generally will appear a little bit smaller than many coyotes. Tracks, several distinguishing things about cats. You don't always get to see nice clear tracks in the snow or sand. The tracks get a little bit, their foot moves and it doesn't leave a nice print or the snow melts. But a couple things to look for on cat feet, and this is true for lynx and mountain lions as well. But the heel pad that you see in this felid track, I don't know if you guys can all see my mouse moving around. Benji, can you see that or not?
Yeah, we can see it a little bit in the lower left there.
You can see my mouse moving if I'm drawing a circle around something?
Yep.
Okay, so the heel pad down here is an important thing to look at if you do get a good print. You can see that in felids, the cats, the back part of the heel pad tends to be 3-lobed here, whereas this canid track on the right tends to just have these 2 lobes, one on each outer corner. But the felids will have 3 lobes on the back. And on the anterior part or the front part of that heel pad, the cats will have two lobes, whereas the canid will just kind of be more one lobe. So that's an important thing to look at when you're looking at tracks. Well, it's not always useful. You know, if you see very notable nail prints, it's more indicative of a canid. Felids, you know, with their retractable claws don't often leave claw marks, but sometimes in slippery snow or mud or whatever, their toes splay and the claws can leave some marks, but they'll usually be smaller and finer colored. Uh, Bobcat tracks tend to be, you know, 1 3/4 to 2.5 inches wide, but I've seen them as big as 3 inches wide for a big male. Scats are always difficult to identify. There's such variability, but one of the things, you know, cat scats, if they're fresh, tend to be a little darker colored. You won't find as much grass or seeds or insects, things like that in them as you might in, say, fox and coyotes or raccoons or things like that. So, and they will tend to use a latrine site over, you know, like a kitty litter box in the wild. So sometimes you can find a lot of scats in one area. The other thing I forgot to mention on the toe is the asymmetry with cats. You can see with canids how these toes are fairly symmetrically spaced around here, whereas on felids there tend to be a little more asymmetry. This left one here is, you know, a little lower than the right toe here. So the toes tend to be a little more asymmetric. You can see it in these snow tracks up here, a little more asymmetry in some of these toes than you would see in canid toe marks. Reproduction, they can breed any time of the year, like you know, any cat. But wild cats, especially in real seasonal environments like Minnesota, where we get notable, you know, winters, they're most likely to breed during February and March only. Males will breed with more than one female. Bobcats that are in their first year can produce a litter, but it's probably a low percent that do and varies a lot from year to year. I'll come back to that point in a minute. And they will typically just produce the one litter per year, but they can have a second litter if the first litter fails for any reason. Birth is usually in early May. Litter size is 1 to 5, but probably average 2 to 3. The kittens do stay with mom a little bit longer than, say, fox or coyote pups, which usually are out on their own after about 6 months of age. Young bobcats will often stay with or at least closer to mom, closer to maybe 10 months, maybe 8 to 12 months. It can be variable, but they do stay with mom a little longer than, say, fox or coyote pups do. This is just some quick data. I mentioned reproduction, but it shows the difference. The top graph shows pregnancy rates, the bottom litter sizes. This is data we've collected for 20 years now. So about 25%, a quarter of the yearling females will produce a litter on average, whereas 3/4, 75% of the adults will. Litter sizes don't vary a lot, but it'll be a little closer to 3 for those adults, a little closer to 2 for those yearling first-time breeding females. They don't dig dens or generally use underground dens. They'll typically den in above ground structures like dense woody cover, debris piles, fallen trees. Michael will talk a little bit more about this on his study. Hollow logs, you know, caves, crevices, and so on. They will often move their kittens to different dens as they grow or for various reasons. If another predator's been harassing them, a lot of reasons they might move, but they typically do. And the males don't generally get much credit for the success of the rearing the young. This is just a little quick video clip, you know, of a mom with 3 kittens. You can also see her scent marking that little log post after the kittens leave. But just kind of a fun little clip in September, I guess this was, of a mom with 3 kittens. This was actually from southern Minnesota. Food habits, very much a generalist. There's not a lot a bobcat can't eat. They are strictly carnivorous. foxes and coyotes will eat berries and a lot more diverse stuff. Cats of all the carnivores are probably the most strict meat eaters, but they eat a lot of stuff. Hares and rabbits are pretty important in many areas. Lots of rodents, mice and voles, squirrels. They can kill deer, adult deer, as well as deer fawns, birds. Next to fishers, which are known to kill and eat porcupines, cats, bobcats, and mountain lions are one of the few other predators known to kill porcupines and eat them. Males do generally eat larger prey. We did a 8-year study on bobcat diets back in the 80s. This would be winter diet, and this is in northern Minnesota. So this was back at a time when snowshoe hares were probably showed more indications of 10-year cycles than they do now. But as snowshoe hares were really important in the north, but as snowshoe hares reached peak levels, they were 70% of the bobcat diet. But as the snowshoe hare cycle declined, hares constituted only about 10% of the diet. And at those hare lows, bobcats made up for that by increasing their diet became 40% deer, probably both live deer as well as just scavenging deer, and 50% rodents. So hare up and down cycles in northern Minnesota historically were a pretty important part of bobcat diet shifts. Probably not as much variability now as there was in the past because hares don't seem to show as distinct a 10-year cycles. This graph just shows that some of that same data, but averaged across all the years. So across those 8 years, 40% of the diet in the north was hares, 25% deer, 12% porcupine, squirrels, and mice. And this is data from Wisconsin that just shows not only was their diet tied to that hare cycle, but it also translated into more reproduction by bobcats when hares were abundant and less reproduction when hares were not as common. So then this was, now 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and this was Wisconsin data. They are capable of taking deer, as you can see from these photos. Specifically looking at fawns, we did do one study in northern Minnesota, deer fawn mortality. It was just 2 years, so not a long study or a large sample size, but from birth to 12 weeks, 1 year, 36% of the fawns died by 3 months of age. The other year, 50% were dead by 3 months of age. Predation by all predators accounted for 86% of those deaths. And of those deaths, of those 86% that died from predation, bobcats, wolves, and bears were the 3 primary predators, but it really varied by those 2 years. So 1 year bobcats took none of the fawns. The other year they were responsible for half of that 86% predation. So that would translate into bobcats having taken 0 to 20% of the fawns in those 2 years in north central Minnesota. With wolves, it was less overall on the fawns, the young fawns. This is again just to 3 months of age. Wolves were taking 1 to 2%. Bears were taking 15 to 20. So bobcats certainly can take deer fawns and adult deer. This shows a little bit of behavior related to caching their prey. Bobcats aren't the only ones to cover and cache prey. Bears certainly do, as will mountain lions. But it was a nice set of photos. I don't think this deer was actually killed by this bobcat. If I remember the story, it might have either been a roadkill or maybe somebody had taken a deer through hunting and not found it right away that night and found it the next day, and about this bobcat had already found it and started eating on it. But you can see the series of photos with the bobcat starting to cover the prey in these 2 right photos, and now it's more covered in the 2 left photos. So they will cache their prey and come back later and finish eating on it. They do have a lot of interactions with other carnivores. This is just one video clip showing a bobcat interacting with a couple coyotes that happen to come down the trail. So we don't know how that story ended. In many parts of the country, coyotes are thought to have some limiting effect on bobcat numbers, but probably not real strong effect. Bobcat kittens may be what's more vulnerable. But certainly there are negative interactions between these species, and sometimes it results in mortality, and sometimes it results in the animals, getting away or having to alter their habitat use or being active at different times of the day than the other species and so on. This photo illustrates also why, forest cover, this is nice prey habitat probably for a bobcat to hunt in, but not a lot of real big trees to escape up. So habitat, has to consider a lot of things. This is just a picture. It was a video, but I just made it a clip. It was a bobcat that had killed a red fox, and somebody happened to get a picture of it on the road. So bobcats can be harassed or killed by other predators. They can turn around and kill other carnivores. This just touches a little on what Michael will get into, but we were doing a study of fishers, and we found fishers den in tree cavities in big trees. And we found a lot of our fishers ended up getting killed by bobcats during the denning season. And this just shows a bobcat coming to this den tree and detecting that there's something up there. And this observation, as well as some others, is what led to the work that Michael's going to talk about. Just about done here. Survival, where harvest is legal, harvest is a key source of adult mortality. Other sources of mortality include starvation, especially with those kittens. A lot probably die from starvation. Also can occur during those deep snow winters in northern Minnesota. We get a lot of bobcats that start showing stress and showing up on people's porches or near bird feeders or getting into a chicken coop. It's more common in those deep snow winters. So winter mortality, starvation is more common for kittens as well as even adults in deep snow. They can get rabies, a variety of other diseases, and die from that. Wolves and coyotes may kill some, cars, and so on. So, they can live up to be 15, 16 years old in the wild, but data we collect says that very few of them live to be past 6 years of age. You can see this example of a tough winter, but this bobcat also had a lot of porcupine quills in its face. This is a really old photo of a porcupine quill that had migrated through the body into the cavity of the bobcat, and we've necropsied bobcats before that have quills in their actual heart. So those quills can migrate through. So bobcats succeed in killing porcupines and eating some, but occasionally they take some injuries and it may even result in death in some cases. They do spend time in trees resting or to avoid predators, but I think they mostly spend their time on the ground hunting. And their den sites are generally on the ground. I already mentioned territoriality. Activity patterns, this is one where still have some data to summarize and learn. The typical description is that they're most active kind of at that, early morning, late afternoon, kind of that dusk dawn period, and maybe at night. But we did a study in northern Minnesota using trail cameras looking at carnivores, and we found that almost all the activity of bobcats was exactly at the middle of the day. Now, we haven't summarized all that data. I think it's going to change some, but it was interesting. Some studies are finding that bobcats are a little more active in the day when the animals like wolves and coyotes are less active. And so presence of other species can really affect activity patterns. This also just shows a little bit about behavior, hunting behavior, even though it's in somebody's yard and the cover is snow, it illustrates that they are a stalk ambush predator, unlike coyotes and foxes that will just chase things down more over extended runs. Bobcats are more of a stalk, hide and stalk kind of a predator. So in this case, even just using snow piles to kind of sneak around. So it really illustrates the hunting behavior and how it's different from. So habitat, I think I'm gonna stop there. I've already gone a few minutes over. They are a habitat generalist. You know, as I said, deserts, near deserts to mountains to grasslands to forests, but they do need a lot of specific things in order to be successful. A lot of structural cover, whether it's a few big trees to climb, fallen logs, good habitat for prey, stalking cover, dense stuff for denning, putting their den sites in. So they like a lot of edges, forest with openings, dense understories. In the winter in the north, they like those lowland conifer swamps that can have reduced snow depths. Riparian areas are really good for bobcats because there tends to be good prey and dense cover along those lake, stream, river edges. So with that, these are just more pictures showing that big picture habitat. You can see there's edges, openings, young forests, trees. So they're a generalist, but they like a lot of the structural complexity near the ground, on the ground, and so on. That I'll stop and let Michael switch over. And I don't know, Benji, if you want me to do any questions or let Michael get through his first.
Michael popped his right up there. So Michael, why don't you just jump in and introduce yourself, and we'll just keep on cruising through your presentation. Oh, it disappeared there. So
Yep, sorry about that. I forgot to unmute myself and I couldn't find a way to do it once I had it shared. Yeah, thanks so much. So really great background information from John. My name is Michael Joyce. I'm a wildlife ecologist with the Natural Resources Research Institute up in Duluth, Minnesota. And so I'm going to talk about this project, like John said, species interactions, bobcats interacting with other carnivores, in this case, the fisher. We really came to this as sort of a tale of two predators from the study that he mentioned. So why do we care about bobcats and fishers? Well, as John mentioned, he's led an 8-year project. They collar about 115 fishers. And what they found was rates of bobcats and other predators, but primarily bobcats, killing fishers at a rate that's not sustainable over the long term. And so this is specifically happening with adult females and is leading to the loss of litters because it happens right as they're starting to give birth or then caring for their young. And so we want to learn more about this. And so the basic question is, why are bobcats killing fishers? And logically, you can come up with a few reasons. Maybe they're using them as a food source. That doesn't really check out because a lot of times when bobcats kill fishers, they don't consume them, or at least don't consume much of them. So doesn't really appear to be the motivation. But by killing fishers, they get enhanced access to the prey that they're competing with fishers for. And if you're a bobcat who needs to leave her vulnerable kittens alone when you go out and forage, it may not be as safe to have a fisher running around your territory. So likely the sort of base motivations here. But really what we're more interested in is looking at this fine scale behavior and where they're encountering each other and what's promoting those encounters. And so we are looking at fine scale habitat use, diet and activity patterns. I won't talk about diet or activity patterns specifically, other than to say our activity data are showing a big peak midday through the afternoon in activity, at least when we average across time. It is variable per individual and by the day. But where are they encountering each other? What does this mean for these interactions? So hereforth, I'm going to forget about fishers again and just focus on bobcats because that's the topic of the day. But we are collecting similar data, what I'm showing on our fishers. And so how are we doing this? How would we go about addressing this question? Well, we're using tools that wildlife biologists have been using for years. The first step is trapping the bobcats and fishers. So we're using cage traps. That decision was based on what season we're targeting them, so fall through winter. Other researchers and fur trappers also use foothold traps, but in the winter, they're not as effective, but also they're a little less safe to use with bobcats, so we're not using those. So this is a type of cage trap that was developed specifically for bobcats. It's kind of tall and skinny. It has this guillotine style door, so the bobcat goes in, the door closes, they're in there when we show up. We put vegetation on it. You can see the picture on the right. There's some white plastic. This is just intended to both camouflage and make it more attractive to the bobcats, but also provide some protection if they're in the trap for several hours and it's windy or it's raining or that kind of thing. And so then we'll put bait, some kind of meat, some olfactory lure, something stinky in there, and then sometimes, most times, some sort of visual attractant as well. Now, bobcats aren't incredibly hard to trap, but they can be finicky. And so we've spent a lot of our project learning and relearning the best approaches to trapping them. And so some frustration, but it's always fun to sort of match wits and be humbled by the animal that you're studying. Once we get them in a trap, you give them an injection to anesthetize them. We then collect samples and measurements, things like weight, some hair samples, some fecal samples to see what they're eating. We'll attach a GPS collar that's going to collect locations and activity information. And we put ear tags on just to help us identify them. And so these collars are actually giving us locations through satellites about every day or two. So we're keeping track of what they're doing at a near real-time time scale. So over 3 years of the project, we captured 20 bobcats. Some of them are too small to wear a collar, so we don't do that. We still collect samples and measurements, give them ear tags, and let them go. But we were able to collar 14 bobcats. By luck, a balanced sample of 7 females and 7 males, mostly subadult to adult. And the males were all adults that we collared. And then the fun part for me, it is fun to trap and collar them, but really the fun part for me is once you let them go to see where they go and then try to figure out what they're doing. So this is an example of some of the data we would get from the satellite. Each of these points is a place where the collar located this bobcat. And what we do then is we could just sit in the office and look at these and keep track of them. But that's not going to tell us what they're doing. You have to get out in the field. And so you can see with my cursor here, there's some clusters here and there's some over here too. And so we go out and visit these sites. And so, for example, here's a site that we visited in the fall for this a young adult female. And here's a spot where she had killed and consumed a grouse. This cluster down here, we found a snowshoe hare that she killed and ate, and 1 or 2 grouse, I can't remember. But with other individuals, we sort of build out this data set of what are they eating and where are they eating it. So here's a situation on the left where we came in the winter, a bobcat had successfully killed a raccoon. We could see from the snow tracks that where it sat, where it lunged, attacked, there was a little bit of a struggle, it killed and then consumed this raccoon. They don't kill everything they eat though, as John mentioned, and here's an example of a wolf-killed deer on the right where we found this bobcat scavenging. So by including these site visits with our larger scale location data and the activity and the diet, we can get a lot more specific information about at a fine scale, how are they using that landscape and what are they using different parts of their territory for. Not all the clusters have prey or kill sites. So we also are finding rest sites. So if you're a bobcat in the winter and it's really cold, you might want to go rest somewhere warm. And so what they tend to do is these on the left is sort of where a root mass pulled up. On the right, there's a bigger log. As these sites get covered with snow, they create a sort of cave where they can go and rest, and it's relatively warmer than the outside temperature. They're protected from wind and likely predators as well. So this is what they do a lot in the winter when they're not out hunting. Just a few general comments. John mentioned right at the end there a little bit about general habitat and habitat generalists, and they use a lot of different stuff, but the 2 patterns that the crew that I'm leading have really identified is this sort of swamp kitty mode. So they really like and spend a lot of time in these places that have really high vegetation density, structural complexity, as John mentioned. On the edges of wetlands, you can see sort of behind here, there's some dogwood, there's some cattails, beaver dams and lodges sometimes. And they do go into the forest, but they spend a lot of time on these edges, especially upland, lowland edges. And so generally, if you're in a place where the vegetation is thick enough that you might poke your eye and it's wet enough that you might get your feet wet, that might be really good bobcat habitat. The other thing that we've noticed, and as John mentioned, bobcats don't really like big urban areas or areas that are super agriculturally dominated. But they do have a certain affinity in some more rural contexts for things that people leave on the landscape. And so the other mode that we talk about a lot is this sort of junkyard cat mode. So here's an example. You can see the yellow points. This young adult female spent a lot of time hunting around this old auto yard. Here's another situation where this female gave birth to a litter in this stack of pallets right next to this building. But it's not just junk. I mean, it is just human structure. So here's an old barn that during the winter, this bobcat went into the barn and presumably was hunting around there. And so they do have a certain affiliation, even in the Superior National Forest, where there's a lot less non-forest habitat. They are finding little cabins and going and checking those out. So it's really interesting to see that and try to figure out what are they doing. So just a few more slides here. John mentioned reproduction and the sort of things that they give birth in. I just want to share some images of what we found with our females. So unfortunately, winter is hard on them here, and we didn't have as many females that either kept a collar on or lived long enough for us to be able to look at their litter size or where they're giving birth. But what we typically see in more natural areas is these really dense vegetation thickets. And so in general, they use those, but it seems like where they give birth and care for their kittens is really the higher end of vegetation density. But usually, you know, again, a root mass here, you can see where the kittens were in this case. But also these, this attraction of these human structures. So this is the female that I showed you before that gave birth underneath those pallets. That was her second litter this year. This is her first one. So she gave birth underneath. You can see there's some big logs and down trees and stuff, but there's also some construction waste. This site was right on the edge of a lawn that was about 200 feet off of a pretty busy highway. So, you know, we don't see them a lot, but they maybe see us and know what we're up to a little more than we think. So here's an example of a female moving her kittens. She had a coyote, a raccoon, and a big male bobcat that was sort of interesting in checking this site out, which we think, in addition to us putting up the cameras, likely prompted her move. And, you know, when they do go out to hunt, they like to hide their kittens where they're not easy to find. And so you guys can all probably see the one kitten here. There's actually a second one under here. And when we went in to try to find them so we could measure them and put ear tags in and that kind of thing, it took us 45 minutes walking in a pretty small area that we knew she was before we were able to find them. In fact, we probably stepped over this site 3 or 4 times before we finally saw them. So they do a good job of hiding them and trying to protect them. So those are just some anecdotes, hopefully gave you a little bit of view into how we study some of the things, some of the information that John mentioned, how we generate that. And I'm not going to read names here, but I do want to just acknowledge this is a team partner effort. I'm here talking, but a lot of members of my lab, various partners, a lot of really generous private landowners who gave us access for trapping and tracking these cats, and funding from the Environmental Natural Resource Trust Fund, who's been a really big supporter of a lot of wildlife research in the state. And with that, I think we can move towards questions. I'm just going to let this animation play. It's just going to loop and I can end it at some point if we need to, Benji. But this is a bobcat chasing a gray squirrel into one of our Fisher den boxes. Is it best if I stop sharing, Benji?
Yeah, why don't you stop sharing that? We only have a couple questions. It was a great presentation. Thank you, both of you, for joining us and sharing your obvious great knowledge and passion for bobcats across the state. I really appreciate that. Brad had a question, probably on John's radar, but how territorial are bobs? He said you have multiple. We have multiple by size and color on our 80-acre property, but never at the same time. So I presume not female with kittens.
Yeah, and Michael may be able to touch on this too, but you know, the general thought is that females are very territorial against other females, but certainly males will overlap females, and even males will sometimes overlap other males, especially at certain times of the year. So females, if they have kittens, didn't lose them, you know, they'll obviously be with mom until probably until winter, maybe even through winter. But otherwise, males and females will overlap some, and males and males will even overlap some. But from what little I know, and Michael can expand again, females are the most territorial of the bunch, keeping other females out. Michael?
Yeah, there's some evidence that the amount to which they exclude other females sort of gets enhanced right as they get ready to give birth. So it is a little bit, there's a little bit of fluctuation. It's not necessarily a hard line between territories. They are sort of jockeying back and forth. But the other thing that we've observed with several of our males is that when you get into February, March breeding season, they'll move well outside of their normal areas searching for mates. And so depending on time of year, we see kittens staying with mom until about breeding season, maybe a little later. But even after they're sort of kicked out, they are still sort of hanging around the area. And so depending on time of year, there could be a number of reasons that you see multiple individuals that don't seem to be mom and kittens.
Brett was also asking, do bobcats predate on beavers? You find any evidence of that in your research, Michael?
Not in the telemetry study, but we have other scats that we've picked up with scat detection dogs for other research where we have found beaver. What I can't tell you, it's really difficult with some of the data in the literature to know whether it's scavenging or predation. A lot of trappers will use beaver carcasses as trapping bait. So they do eat beavers. I'm not aware of a specific observation of them killing them, although they can get them, away from the water. I would not doubt that they could.
Ryan had a question. What effect do bobcats have on wild turkey and grouse populations?
Yeah, I can't answer that with this data from a study. Obviously, they probably eat both of those. I think I can say fairly confidently it's not likely bobcats alone have much influence. I mean, turkey, as our bobcats have expanded in numbers by a lot in northern Minnesota, our turkey population is expanding. So you don't see some inverse relationship. And grouse generally are, for lack of a better way of saying it, they're built to withstand predation. They produce large clutches, just like pheasants and other. They do that because they know many are going to die from predation, but it won't affect the population. So at a big scale, probably having little effect. Obviously, if you have a bobcat right on your 40 acres and you had a flock of turkeys, they may chase them out, they may kill a few, but the big picture is probably not having much of effect, even though they're clearly killing some.
Yeah, and while I didn't talk about our diet data specifically, we haven't linked it to snowshoe hare availability, but generally it supports what John talked about from that previous study where they do eat grouse. We haven't documented turkeys in our scats yet. I don't know that we will because we're through most of them, but they do eat grouse, there's no question, but snowshoe hares are making up the bulk of what we identify in their scats. And so while they're killing them, it doesn't seem to be a major item that they focus on. Again, we still need to look at the hair cycle and see how or whether that might affect it, similar to what the old study found. But
John, I think this one is more directed to you. Anthony had two questions in here. We're running short on time, so I get to both of them. But he said years ago he harvested a 42-pound bobcat, and he was wondering if there's a Minnesota state record for bobcat. And then he was also wondering about hunting versus trapping. Who harvests more, hunters or trappers?
Yeah, first question, no, we don't maintain any sort of, record books for bobcat weights or sizes or anything. I sometimes, I don't know if other organizations do, the Safari Club or anybody else, but we don't. We've had reports of some that are getting close to 50 pounds, certainly, close to 45. But most of those are not ones I've verified with, any certified scale. So I think that 45-pound is a really, really big top end one, maybe occasionally one a little bigger. The other question on relative numbers with hunting versus trapping take of bobcats in Minnesota, most of the take is through trapping, about 85%, and about 15% is hunting. in the state of Wisconsin, our neighbor, it's about the exact opposite of that. And probably because they allow bear hunting with hounds, there's more people with hounds that just, like to pursue critters with hounds. And so in Minnesota, there aren't as many people. You can't use dogs with bears. And so doesn't seem to be as popular, even though it is legal to use hounds to tree bobcats. 85% of our harvest is trapping and 15% hunting, various types of hunting. So some is opportunistic hunting, a grouse hunter, a deer hunter, saw one while they were out and took one, but some is predator calling and maybe a few with hounds as well.
And I'll just jump in quick on the weights, besides the record. From our study and from other studies I've reviewed, 40+ pound bobcats are rare. They'd be quite a thing to see up close. A lot of the adult males we had were in sort of the mid-30s, and that's a pretty good sized bobcat. When we're handling them, they look really big. So yeah, 40 are definitely the rare exceptions and likely a treat to see when you get the opportunity.
Great. Jesse was wondering, I guess, get your opinion on how is climate change predicted to affect bobcat population in Minnesota?
I think in general, it's probably, I would say it's probably predicted to be beneficial, but I'm one that the more I've been in this job, the less comfortable I am with predicting very far out in the future. There's just a lot of things that are, even if we know certain conditions are going to persist, it's hard to predict how animals will adjust, adapt. So I do think, less snow is probably good for bobcats, or wetter snow because it's more compacted will allow them to, occupy deep snow areas that maybe they couldn't historically. If some of the climate change conditions favor deer, based on less severe winters or certain forest types, deer are, I think, in some northern areas important, at least seasonally, to bobcats. You get one deer in winter, that's a lot of food for a while. So I think in general, climate change up to a point anyway is probably going to be beneficial to bobcats. I'm curious if Michael has any perspective on that too, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think the winter energetics and that bottleneck is a big part of it. So reduced snow, warmer temperatures will cause them less energy. But and the other thing is, as John showed in the range map, they exist quite a bit farther south than here. So warming temperatures and conditions shouldn't necessarily be bad. But you also have to ask, if you have an increase in deer at the same time with reduced winter severity, what is that going to do to the other predator community? How might that feed back to bobcats? So it is a really complex question. The immediate answer from a snow and cold is probably positive, but you have to see how the rest of the system responds to that to really have a good idea. It's a good place to make some predictions that we can test as we look into the future.
Great. We had quite a few questions that came in here in the last couple of minutes, but we're not going to have time to get through all of them. So those of you that joined a little bit late asking about fishers and grouse diets and stuff like that, a lot of that was covered towards the beginning of the program, so you can come back and rewatch it. That's why we record these. But if you do have other questions that you want to answer, please feel free to reach out to myself or John or Michael, and we will get those questions to you when we can. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's a beautiful, cool day here in Minnesota fall, and hunting season's coming up fast. Next week, we're going to talk about late season pheasant hunting. So getting out there and trying to target some birds before the snow really flies. So thanks both of you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Everybody stay safe out there.